And we're live. Hi, welcome back, Blakely. We
No.
are here again. Max's mom. I'm Max's mom from MaxLove Project, and we are doing another one of our Google Plus Hangout on Air mini sessions with Blakely Page to talk about some of the main topics in anti-cancer healthcare for kids. And also with all sorts of life-threatening, life-limiting illnesses, we find that there are a lot of commonalities among these illnesses, and there's some basic nutrition principles that can really, really help families to just come to understand a little bit better. So we want to talk about carbohydrates today. We're going to talk in some of these segments, we're going to talk a lot about macronutrients. A lot of the discussion of anti-cancer foods has centered around micronutrients, and those are those awesome cancer-fighting, all sorts of different, whether it's nutrients or Blakely, you can help me out here. We've got the polyphenols and all of these different sorts of thousands of amazing things that usually come in plants and plant-based products that help curb inflammation and kind of curb angiogenesis. They help us fight cancer by restricting, the drawing of blood to the tumor and things like that. But a really, really big principle for us has also been learning about the macronutrient components to fighting cancer, and that's really looking at the big ones. That's looking at carbohydrate, fat, protein, and I feel like this kind of overlooked a little bit when talking about fighting cancer. So we want to talk about today, what is a carbohydrate and why does that matter to us if we're fighting cancer or diabetes or even a kind of an autoimmune challenge? So I'll hand it over to you, Blakely.
All right. So carbohydrate is one of your macronutrients. It's really our body's fastest source of energy. It's not necessarily its preferred source of energy, but it's the fastest source. The body's preferred source of energy would actually be fat, to burn fat versus burn carbohydrates, but carbohydrates are our fastest source. And our carbohydrate foods are grains, so all of your breads, pasta, rice, quinoa, couscous, all of the grains, amaranth, whether it's a gluten-free grain or a gluten-containing grain, all of those are still starches, all of those are still carbohydrates. Our other carbohydrates are starchy vegetables like corn, peas, and potatoes. Those are carbohydrates, as well as milk has carbohydrate and beans have carbohydrate. So, and one differentiation is that milk and yogurt have carbohydrate, but cheese does not have carbohydrate. The way that it's made and what it actually contains is not a carbohydrate food. It's considered more of a protein and a fat. Sugar is carbohydrate. So one of the things, if you look at your food label, you will see on there total carbohydrates. And then under that total carbohydrate title, you will see dietary fiber and sugars. And it's confusing for some people, and we don't always remember that sugars are carbohydrate and fiber is carbohydrate. So the numbers won't add up exactly, but generally your total carbohydrate number includes your level of sugar and your level of fiber. So if you are counting carbohydrates, then all you need to look at is that total carbohydrate number. The reason it would be beneficial to look at the sugar number is because that's going to sometimes tell you the quality of your carbohydrate. Because if you have a carbohydrate that's high in sugar, that means that you're going to get a big, fast blood sugar spike, and then you're probably going to crash down really quick, and then we get all the inflammatory properties that sugar causes. And so you want to be careful to look at to not pay attention only to the sugars, but also pay attention to the carbohydrates. Because if you had a potato, it would have, a lot of carbohydrate, but not as much sugar. If you had sweet tarts, it would have, a lot more sugar than, something like a potato. So, as far as looking at what we do with our carbohydrates, generally in this format, and when you're around MaxLove Project and when you're around me, we're going to be generally leaning more towards a lower carbohydrate approach. The reason for that is because too much carbohydrate will spike up your blood sugar, and that's going to cause an inflammatory response. Anytime we eat carbohydrates, our blood sugar rises. That's what the body's designed to do. That is an okay process. That is not bad. When we eat carbohydrates, our blood sugar rises, and the body produces insulin, and insulin is what kind of unlocks the door for the sugar from that carbohydrate that you ate to get from the cell your blood into your cell where it's supposed to go. So insulin is kind of the gatekeeper to get the sugar from our foods where it's supposed to go. But if we just pound our body with too much carbohydrate all the time, that process gets derailed and doesn't work as efficiently. That's where you get a lot of your that's where you get your type 2 diabetes. That's where you get just the chronic inflammatory states. The reason that the carbohydrate conversation is so important in the cancer world is because cancer will always feed on sugar. And as we just said, carbohydrates are always sugar. So no matter what type of carbohydrate you eat, it will always break down to its smallest level to a glucose molecule. So whether you eat an apple, a potato, a piece of whole wheat bread, rice, Starburst, Kit Kat, any type of carbohydrate is going to break down to a glucose molecule. And we know the research is clear. There's no longer a debate that cancer feeds on sugar. And so when we're looking at fighting cancer, we're looking at giving the body a break and being able to decrease the level of sugar / carbohydrate that the body ingests so that the cancer doesn't have as much fuel. That's the bottom line for why carbohydrates, the general bottom line for why carbohydrates are important in the cancer discussion. And then, as I mentioned before, I mentioned inflammation. Inflammation is a key component of not only cancer, but of our autoimmune diseases, like Audra mentioned, our chronic inflammatory diseases like heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes. Those are all inflammation-based. And when we're getting those big blood sugar spikes and the blood sugar is not really steady, then we're creating inflammation in our body. All of our processed refined sugars, although they still have a place in our diet, you know, for someone who's even on a ketogenic diet, they still have a place every now and then. They're still going to happen. So they still have a place, but those are generally inflammatory foods. And so all of our processed refined sugars are going to be inflammatory. And obviously, when you're fighting cancer, you want to be decreasing inflammation as much as possible. So that's why in these types of conversations, in this group of friends, we're kind of generally looking at how do we keep our carbohydrate low, where we're keeping inflammation low, and giving the body kind of a break from having to work so hard at that inflammation process. So that's kind of a general overview. Audra, why don't you kind of ask additional questions or kind of lead me to where you think we might have missed something there?
That's amazing, Blakely. Thank you so much for that. It's an amazing overview. One thing that comes to mind for us is when we were, personally for our family, when we still were on a carbohydrate-based diet. We are now on a very low-carb diet, but previously when we were transitioning, and we really believe in the pathway approach with our nonprofit organization. It's so hard to make any changes overnight, and there's a learning curve, and it can be so disheartening along the way because of our food system and what's really available to us. So one thing that we started to do after our son was diagnosed with cancer is that we just removed any added refined sugars. We just drew the line there, and that worked for us. Now, for someone else, it may be Kit Kats, and it may be just, it may be just like the constant, like Sour Patch Kids or something, But for us, that was the line that we were able to draw, and we said, all right, no added refined sugars. We're going to use stevia, erythritol, and still provide some sweets because, we have, little kids, and we definitely needed some incentives there. And then we started to look at the quality of the carbohydrates that we were eating. So when it came to whole grains, and it came to, we did away with white potatoes and said, but sweet potatoes, you can see the fiber. It's like filled with fiber, So we made sure with the breads that we were eating that we were getting a really low sugar per serving, so like 1 gram of sugar per serving, and then we were going for a ratio of 1 gram of dietary fiber per 10 grams of carbohydrate at the very least. And the theory behind that was, and you can confirm this for us, was that at least you're getting a lot of fiber, which is great, and then you're also slowing how that carbohydrate is metabolized and broken down into glucose into the smallest molecule. Do you recommend that type of approach when choosing your carbohydrates?
I do. You can definitely make lots of headway in just changing the quality of your carbohydrates, even if you're not able to transition to a lower carbohydrate diet right away. And so getting the fiber up is really helpful. I think even for most people, again, this is kind of one of my personal soapboxes that you'll hear often. I always want people to look at the effect that gluten might be having on their body. because gluten may be a really additional inflammatory factor. So it might be for someone that they decrease the overall carbohydrates, or that they start with cutting out the processed sugars, or for another family they might do a gluten-free trial and make sure that their body, isn't reacting to gluten. In which case they would lean more towards rice and potatoes as their starch options. It definitely has to be a step-by-step process, especially when kids are involved. And one way that I sometimes, to continue on the fiber discussion, the fiber is really helpful in helping determine the quality, because if you've got a higher fiber content item, then your level of processed or refined or sugar is going to be really low. You can't have a whole, you can't have a whole bunch in there together. It just doesn't work that way. So, if you have a total carbohydrate, you've got a balance and a ratio of sugar to fiber, and that's what makes up that carbohydrate. And the fiber acts as a buffer for blood sugar rise, just like Audra said. Other things work as well. So protein and fat also work to buffer blood sugar. And so a lot of times when I'm working on kind of trying to get people's metabolism a little bit more stable, where their blood sugar is more stable, then I'll talk about not eating any naked carbs. So a naked carb would be a plain piece of bread, rice by itself, something that's not a carbohydrate, that's not a plain piece of fruit, something that's not paired with a fat or a protein source. So that's why some of our traditional combinations like nuts and fruit and cheese, why those combinations work so well together. They work well for our palate. They also work well for our body, because that fat and protein is going to help buffer the blood sugar rise, keep our blood sugar more stable, and not create as much inflammation.
I think that's amazing, and it's a really good point to make when you look at how our grandparents ate. When you look at the bread loaded with butter, or for my family, it would have been doused in, soaked in olive oil, and it's very antithetical to the low-fat movement of the late 70s and early 80s. As everything became a naked carb and increased huge amounts of naked carbs. Now we're going back to say there is such a great reason why that butter was all over that bread, and continuing on that pathway. And the good news with that is, generally kids and families enjoy that. We love that, and we don't have to feel bad about it. And you'll find, instead of eating 20 pieces of that bread, you'll be fine after 1 or 2, because you loaded it up with a good fat.
That's a great example. If I have a piece of gluten-free bread, for example, I might literally have about 1/4 an inch of grass-fed butter on there. If I make rice, I'm going to load up my rice with butter while I'm cooking it, and then I'm going to add butter at the end after it's cooked as well. And that, is a good quality grass-fed butter, either from our local farmer where we get some hand-rolled butter, or from the store that's grass-fed. And so that's a great way. Again, that's a way to buffer.
So carbohydrate, is it about half the calories of fat? So when you're looking at the same volume, fat's about twice the calorie value. I'm not a dietitian or anything at all, but it seems like you're theoretically eating a lot less of it. When we are preparing, I'll scramble 2 eggs, and I will, have a beautiful, pool of kind of softly melted butter in the pan, because they do it over really low heat. And I whisk in pasture-raised heavy cream to a good amount, and then I really slowly scramble them. And so and then I'm, cooking, because I was a cook. We call it, we'll mount it with butter at the end. And so it's a beautifully fatty, amazing product at the end. And 2 eggs is all I can have for hours. There's no bread. I'm kind of thinking back in the day, we used to say bacon and eggs. You have bacon and eggs. Do you have bacon, eggs, and toast? Is that the saying? No, it's bacon and eggs. And it seems like there is some I don't know, some good sort of traditional wisdom there, maybe.
There really is. Yeah, there really is, because you can do so much. You can do so much with your vegetables, fats, and meats. And your small amounts of fruits, that those are really your nutrient-dense foods. The other thing about carbohydrates is that there's only a small subset of carbohydrates that are actually nutrient-dense. So when I talk about nutrient density, it's the amount of nutrition, the amount of vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals, polyphenols, all those things that we really need for our body to recognize real food and recognize nourishment. Those are in nutrient-dense foods. Our nutrient-dense carbohydrates are our fruits and our starchy tubers. So like our potatoes and sweet potatoes, and you know, so there's a few other starchy tubers which aren't very typically used, but you know, our fruits and our starchy vegetables are really the only nutrient-dense carbohydrates. The rest of the carbohydrates, even beans, I think, have a place and they're okay, but they're not nutrient-dense. I'm not opposed to beans, but they're not nutrient-dense. Rice, breads, pastas, those are what I call fillers. So they fill, but they don't nourish. And so that's another reason to look at the quality of your carbohydrate, is that we want nutrient-dense foods. We want as much nutrition packed into the foods that we eat, where we're not just filling our bodies, but we're nourishing our bodies. And that's what the typical child's diet is, all fillers. You know, it's macaroni and cheese, it's breads, it's crackers, it's Cheez-Its, it's, you know, chicken nuggets only because there's the breading on the outside that is what they really want, you know, is the salt and the breading. But I've seen fabulous results with kids when we start cooking their vegetables in real butter, and we start adding real butter to their eggs, you know, just like you mentioned. They actually like them. I mean, I know a kid whose mom didn't believe me. She put, and I think he was only about 3 or 4, but she started cooking vegetables in real butter, and he started eating all kinds of vegetables he'd never eaten. That's not everybody's story, but for that kid's body, I think he just needed that fat source so much that his body was craving it, and those vegetables tasted so good. And so, you know, like Audrey had already kind of mentioned, the quality of our carbohydrate is really where I want the carbohydrate conversation to land, is that carbohydrates are not bad. They have their place. I think everyone's body tolerates a different level of carbohydrate, and so some people really thrive on very low carbohydrates. Other people really need more carbohydrates, and that's the way their body's designed, and I think it's important to find that balance for you. So carbohydrates are not bad. A low carbohydrate diet is not better. It's that just when we are looking at fighting cancer, we are looking at decreasing inflammation, and typically lower carbohydrate diets are going to help with that inflammation. And the quality of our carbohydrates our carbohydrate quality needs to reside in our starchy tubers, you know, our potatoes, and our fruit.
That's an excellent point. It strikes me that, you know, years ago, you know, in our grandmother's days, we weren't talking about low carbohydrate diets because we didn't necessarily have high carbohydrate diets, and we certainly didn't have the processed food diet. So I think it's a great point to make that it's you know, not a matter of if carbohydrates are good or bad objectively, like flat. We're talking about the quality and often the quantity, and then figuring out for you and your family what that's going to be. I mean, we have 3 members of our family on a ketogenic type diet and another who's sort of paleo, and we're all different. Each and every one of us, we have totally different considerations that we have to make for our bodies, so we have a long way to go to really help families identify where they believe they are and where they think they want to be, and then honor that individuality along the way and figure out, you know, I found out I need more carbohydrate in my diet than what I, you know, was eating as I transitioned to this, and my husband, you know, does really well with a lot less. And how do we kind of honor our own, you know, sense of understanding of ourselves and become attuned to that? So I guess that's the discussion for another segment.
Right.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Blakely. We really appreciate this. It's like a little 101 kind of push in these little segments, and we'll be coming back next time as we sort of segued a lot into fat. So that's another thing we really want to talk about for our families, is to talk about fat, and we will be also doing a segment on protein. So thank you so much, Blakely.
All right.
Okay, bye.